Medullary rays are cells within a tree that run from the center of the tree out to the bark, much like the spokes of a bike wheel. It has a bunch of different names, but this feature is commonly called ray fleck and is one of the neat characteristics of quarter-sawn white oak. I'm Mike Frankton. Welcome back to my shop, aka the Boardroom. In this video, we're going to build an arts and crafts inspired fireplace mantel. And like most projects, this one starts with breaking down materials into oversized parts that will be fine-tuned as the project is built. I pay special attention to the lumber selected for the fronts of the legs, as this is the most visible part of the project. How do I know what size to cut my parts to, you ask? Well, here's a look at my actual drawings. The first one is of the job site. The second is my working drawing. And the term working drawing is used loosely. Most of the time I end up changing things a little. In this case, the legs ended up at 6.5 inches wide versus 6 because that's how wide the lumber was that I got. And I don't cut down beautifully quarter sawn white oak lumber any narrower than it needs to be. But when making changes like this, I always work against maximum or minimum parameters, such as width, height, or depth, so I know that the project will still fit in the space. After the parts have been sized, it's time for some joinery. For this, I break out the mighty biscuit joiner. After cutting the slots in the sides of the leg, I make a cutter height adjustment on my biscuit joiner and cut the slots in the fronts of the legs. I realize having a biscuit joiner with this feature is somewhat decadent. If your biscuit joiner doesn't have this feature, or you use something like the domino, no problem. Just cut a few shims of differing thicknesses. Laminate for countertops or even veneer work great for this purpose. That's what I used to do before purchasing this particular biscuit joiner. So why do this? It creates a small offset to ensure the front overlaps the side. This overlap is easily sanded or routed off later with a flush trim bit. Once the necessary slots have been cut, I add some gravy and clamp everything up. These small assemblies are the tops of the legs, and if you stick with me, you'll see how all this comes together. Now it's time to turn my attention, or lack thereof, to the top section, which will rest on top of the two legs. The first thing I need to do is create a small offset between the centerpiece and the tops of the legs. This is accomplished again with the biscuit joiner. I add this little clip-on spacer, which really all it does is set the tool up to cut slots centered on 1/2 inch thick material. Then I just cut a slot referencing the inside of one piece and the outside of the other piece. The end result are pieces joined successfully at a consistent offset. Next up is some reinforcement for the corners. I only add these small plywood chunks to the corners versus across the whole piece because I need access to the area behind the top section during installation. Also, one of the side benefits of using a biscuit joiner is a part can be slid in at an angle where there's joinery at 90 degrees to each other. Binding would occur had I used dominoes or dowels in this situation. I lean heavily upon my excellent judgment when sizing little trim pieces like this one. Once happy, I clean up the front edge with my double taper sanding disc, which is a great tool for sanding the edges of a workpiece. If you'd like to learn more about this super-tastic tool, you'll find a link in the description below. I have fixed the trim piece yet again with some more biscuits, and the corner joint is a simple butt joint, which I used to go with some of the other furniture and built-ins around the home. And with that, the center section of the mantle is done. I glue it up, and now it's time to move on to making some corbels. The first step is to make a template. I make sure that the curve is fair, it fits nicely, and the bottom lands fully on the lower trim piece. I wanted the corbels to be about 2.5 inches wide. I don't have access to white oak that thick, so that means I needed to glue a few pieces together. It's not my first choice, but sometimes it's the only option. Anytime I'm faced with this tedious task, I pull my head out of my rear end where it's normally kept, and I pay attention to grain. I flip boards around until I make the seams as close to invisible as possible. Once I've overanalyzed the grain enough, I glue the smaller chunks into larger chunks. I don't want to toot my own horn, but not too shabby. Next up, I size the blanks at my magnificent bandsaw and I proceed with cutting the curve. I have my bandsaw set up for making straight cuts. The blade I'm running it has a 3/4 inch band and a very narrow tooth set. So anytime I cut a curve, I have to make a series of relief cuts, which allow the blade some room to make the turn. It doesn't leave the smoothest surface, but fear not, a little work at the sander will solve this problem. After cutting to final height, I figure out exact placement. The side ones are biased an inch to the front. I also make sure I'm happy with how they look relative to the overhang of the faux top I have in place. After that, I cut biscuit slots to hold them in place temporarily. Corbels won't be glued in place until installation, as I'm going to hide a few mounting screws behind them. The top is 2 pieces of plywood glued together. The added stability of plywood here is helpful. The top is about 14 inches deep. If I were to make it from solid wood, it's possible it could shrink 1/4 inch or more, depending on moisture content. Keep in mind I live at 6,000 feet in a very dry climate, so lumber will tend to shrink from the time it arrives in the area until it's happily at equilibrium. Then we'll have small seasonal changes from there. I let the top dry overnight. The following day, I come back and clean up the edges and cut to size. Once the top has been cut to size, I add some edging. Again, I use butt joints, which have the added benefit of being much faster and easier than miter joints. I clamp everything in place with the often dismissed pipe clamp. I install the edging long and cut it down after the glue is dry. I find this much easier than trying to cut parts to exact length and align them during glue up. I use a really neat tool known as a lipping planer to flush the edging to the surface of the plywood. I flip the piece over and I set the tool so it leaves a little lip on the bottom edge. This lip is an insurance policy for installation. The top is just going to be sitting on the mantle glued in place. If that seam isn't airtight, this lip will help hide that. I use a laser sharp hand plane to get to the corners where the lipping planer can't reach. With that, the top is complete minus some finish sanding. Now it's back to the corbels. I'm adding a cool feature called a stocking rod. I don't know that this is a period original detail, but it looks nice and is a great place to hang Christmas stockings. I start by drilling a hole, then marking for the square steel tube. Then I begin squaring the hole by hand, and I finish off with the hollow chisel mortiser. Why not just use a 1/2 inch bit in the hollow chisel mortiser, you ask? Well, the steel tube wouldn't fit through. The hole needed to be just a little over 1/2 inch for the steel tubing to slide in by hand. I cut the 1/2-inch square tube to length with the ample power of my right arm and follow that up with some paint. I lay down a couple of coats of primer and finish that off with a few coats of black paint. Quick song recommendation, Dead Man's Party by Oingo Boingo. Why that song? Well, it's a pretty good song, but my kids like to dance to it, and that's really cute. So there you go. The bare end of the tubing needed a cover, so I glue a couple pieces together. Here is video footage of the first time the shop apprentice has actually asked and then actually wanted to help out on a project in the shop. I had him on glue duty, and we knocked out the clamping as a team. And of course, after completion, it was high fives, thumbs up, and headbutts for everyone. Once dry, I squared up the blocks and proceeded to drill and square out the hole the same way that I did with the corbels. From there, I cut them to length. I added a slight pyramid shape to the ends, and I did a little sanding. Here's a look at the center section all mocked up. Quick design note, I cut these squares the same width as the end caps for the stocking rod. I'll show more about these later. I decided to add a couple of pocket holes as well as a biscuit to align and hold the legs to the center section. At this point, the building is complete. Now it's time to break it down, do some sanding as well as some finishing. However, there's one small detail that will be added once the finish has been applied. These little squares are added to the legs just to give it a little more zazzle. The stain is some custom unnamed medium brown reddish color. It was provided by the customer to match some of the other furniture in the house. It's oil-based, and I applied it using the good old-fashioned wipe-on, wipe-off method. Once the stain was dry, I sprayed a few layers of clear coat for protection. I left the square detail off the legs to make the staining process easier. Wiping on and off stain around stuff can be annoying, and it can cause an uneven look around the object that's in the way. So I finished these separate and I glue them on with some epoxy. I make a couple jigs to ensure accurate placement. I also glue on one of the end caps with the same epoxy. Shifting venues, here's the fireplace in need of a mantel. The house is over 100 years old, and the last time it had been redressed looked like it was from the 70s, give or take a decade. So this time around, some new tile, a new firebox, and a mantel should have this space looking sharp as a tack. I milled up a 2x12 to fit inside the center section of the mantel. The plan is to attach this to the brick with the correct overhang on each side with some masonry screws and construction adhesive. I start by drilling a pilot hole in the 2x12. I set it in place, then I just kiss the surface of the brick with a hammer drill through that pilot hole. Then I move the 2x12 out of the way and complete the hole. The old hammer drill doesn't get to come out and play all too often, but it's a lifesaver in these situations. Trying to drill that hole with a normal drill is no fun at all. I lay down a pillowy bed of construction adhesive, then drive the masonry screws into their new home. I attached the legs with the pocket holes I drilled earlier, and now it's time to put this bad boy in place. Before the mantel would slide all the way to the wall, I needed to cut the base molding out of the way. I did that with a multi-tool. I didn't show that because I couldn't get the camera close enough to see what I was doing. It would have been a 5-minute clip of my rear end, which for as great as that would have been for everyone, I decided to leave that part out. At any rate, with the baseboards out of the way, I needed to scribe the legs just a little to get the front face to touch the floor. Depending on how much material needs to be removed, a carpenter's pencil can be great for marking scribe lines. I cut to my scribed lines with a small handsaw, and now the dress rehearsals are over. It's time for the real deal. I scooch the mantle in place, drill through the front into the 2x12, and use some 2-inch screws for rock solid attachment. I add a shim as needed so as not to bow the mantle inward. I left about a 1/4 inch play between the mantle and the 2x12. I pre-drill for a 6-penny finish nail to hold the lower portion of the legs in place. I used 5 screws to hold the upper section. These nails are really only there to prevent the legs from flopping around. Also, the nice thing about using a nail is if the mantle is ever removed, there's only going to be a tiny hole in the flooring. I go as far as I dare with a hammer. When I'm too close for missiles, I switch to this spring-loaded nail set. This doodad is quite handy. It has a large end and a small end, and you just stretch her out and let her rip. On to the finishing details. I glue on the corbels with some self-mixing epoxy, which is totally awesome to have around the job site. That gasp was the sound of sheer, unadulterated terror. It was that very moment in time I realized the stocking rod needed to be slid in before gluing on the final corbel. Otherwise, the walls on either side would get in the way. Being the stalwart professional that I am, I used my thinks and thoughts to come up with a solution. I simply pulled off the corbel within the allotted 5 minutes before the epoxy sets. I installed the stocking rod and put everything back together. After that, I carpe'd the DM. Crisis averted, drinks all around, Mike for the win. Once the problem was solved, I could put my head back in my rear end where it's most comfortable. I will say I'd rather be lucky than good. That could have turned into a real problem had I not caught that. I'm most proud of myself, though, that I didn't drop a 500-pound F-bomb right in the living room of my customer's house. Almost complete, which is good. I'm getting delirious. I hold the top in place with some construction adhesive, and I fill the 2 nail holes at the bottom of the legs with Blendall sticks, which is just a fancy word for wood color Crayola crayons. Here's a small but important detail. I installed the mantle with reveals sized to the grout lines of the tile. The tile guy is scheduled to come back and add some grout to this area, which will really finish off the installation. Couple of finished shots. I think it turned out pretty good. I also think it fits the look and feel of the house really well. I enjoyed building this project, and I hope you enjoyed following along. Thank you very much for watching. Till next time.